When February arrived, I found myself driving back to my mother's house in Fort Worth. The drive felt longer than it used to, even though the miles hadn't changed. The air inside the car was heavy, as if I carried the silence from January's memorial dinner all the way with me. Walking up the porch steps, I could hear laughter from inside, though it was sharper than warm, the kind of laughter that builds walls instead of breaking them down. Once inside, I noticed quickly how the rhythm of the household had shifted. Sophronia's voice carried through the rooms, giving directions about groceries and upcoming bills as if the house belonged to him. My mother stood nearby, nodding, occasionally asking him questions that used to be mine to answer. "Don't forget the safe," she said, her voice steady, confident. "You'll have to keep an eye on the papers." I stood in the doorway, unacknowledged. For years, when my father was alive, I was the one he trusted to organize documents, pay bills when he was away, and lock up important items. Now, that role had been reassigned without discussion. "Possession is 9/10 of the law," I remembered hearing once, and it struck me how even small gestures, who holds the keys, who checks the mail, determine who owns the narrative. Here, Sophronia wasn't just given errands. He was being crowned. I sat in the living room, pretending to scroll through my phone, but I watched every detail. It was clear. The transfer of power had already begun. Later that afternoon, while relatives lingered in the kitchen and the scent of cornbread filled the air, my mother reached into a drawer and pulled out a keychain. I froze when I saw the glint of familiar brass, the keys to the house, and the family safe. She extended her hand toward Sophronia. "You'll need these for your business dealings," she told him matter-of-factly. I rose from my chair. "Why him?" I asked. "I've always handled the documents with Dad. He trusted me." Her eyes flicked to me, then away, her lips tightening. "Times change. We need someone reliable." Reliable. That word hung in the air like an insult dressed as a compliment. I swallowed hard, not from weakness, but to hold back the storm. I understood now. Reliable meant obedient to her new order, not loyal to the old one. Sophronia caught my eye, smirking as he dangled the keys from his finger like a trophy. "Don't worry," he said smoothly. "I'll make sure everything is taken care of." I didn't answer. Instead, I let silence stand where anger might have burned me. The symbolism wasn't lost. Keys meant control. They opened doors, locked out voices, rewrote the rules of who belonged. With those keys, Sophronia now controlled both the past, the safe where Dad's papers had been, and the future of the house. By evening, most relatives had left, and the house grew quiet again. I wandered into the living room, more out of habit than curiosity. My steps slowed as soon as I looked up at the wall of family portraits. Something had changed. Where once hung a large photo of me and Dad at my college graduation, his arm around me, pride shining in his tired eyes, there was now an empty space. In its place hung a freshly framed photo, Sophronia in a sharp suit, standing beside Mom and her husband at a recent charity event, smiles polished, the kind that looked rehearsed. I stepped closer, scanning the wall. My father's presence was minimal now, and my place had been erased altogether. "You don't look surprised," Sophronia's voice came from behind me. I turned, and there he stood with a glass in hand. "Maybe it's time you accepted the new family picture." I took a deep breath, grounding myself. "Erasing a picture doesn't erase the truth," I replied softly. He chuckled. "Truth is what people see, and right now they see me standing at the center." It wasn't just a missing photo, it was psychological warfare. A quiet rewriting of history, piece by piece, until my existence in this family became optional. Maya Angelou's words echoed in my mind. "You may not control all the events that happen to you, but you can decide not to be reduced by them." I turned back to the wall, forcing myself to absorb the sting without showing it. They could rearrange frames, replace faces, and distribute keys, but they couldn't take away what Dad entrusted to me. Back in my apartment that night, I sat at my desk with the Rolex in my hand. The weight of it felt different now, heavier, not from gold, but from meaning. That watch was never just about timekeeping. It was a memory, a warning, and a command. My father's last words echoed, Take care of yourself and keep this watch safe. The connection was sharp in my mind. Keys and photos weren't just about logistics or decor. They were tools of power, signals of who was written into the story and who was being written out. I decided then. I wouldn't confront them directly. Not yet. Anger without strategy is wasted. I would watch, wait, gather what I needed. There's an old American saying, "Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me." They fooled me tonight by handing away what was mine, but it wouldn't happen again. As I gathered my things to leave, I heard Sophronia's voice low behind me, whispering to my mother, "She's out, Mom. We've already decided." My heart sank, but only for a moment. Those words weren't just conversation. They were a verdict. And I knew then that this wasn't the end. Their decision was made without me, but I knew the real fight hadn't even begun. That night I couldn't sleep. The silence in my apartment felt louder than any voice. Something kept gnawing at me, a pull I couldn't ignore. Around midnight, I drove back to the house and slipped into my father's old study. The drawers smelled faintly of paper and dust, familiar in a way that broke me and steadied me at the same time. I opened one drawer and rummaged through folders that should have been untouched. Then my fingers brushed against a thick envelope buried under loose receipts. I pulled it out, my hands trembling. Inside was a draft of my father's original will. My name was written clearly, designated for the Rolex and a portion of savings he had set aside. But next to it was another document, newer, with my name erased as though I had never been considered. The signatures didn't match. The pages looked swapped. I stared at them, my stomach tightening. "A paper can lie," I whispered to myself, "but ink leaves shadows." I studied the margins, the way the pen pressed harder in some lines than others. They thought I wouldn't notice, but as the saying goes, the devil is in the details. By dawn, I was still awake, still holding both documents. The next morning, I confronted my mother in the kitchen. She was pouring coffee, the smell of it rich and bitter, when I laid the envelope on the table. "Care to explain this?" I asked. She glanced down and her hand froze. For a flicker of a second, guilt flashed across her face, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. "Don't go digging where you don't belong," she said firmly. Sophronia strolled in, dressed as if heading to a meeting he had invented for himself. He saw the papers and smirked. "Looks like someone's been busy," he said. "Dad trusted me," I snapped. "He wanted me to keep the Rolex safe. He knew I could be counted on." Sophronia leaned against the counter, grinning. "Trust is earned. Maybe you just imagined he said that." I ignored him, looking at my mother. "You replaced his words with someone else's. Did you think I wouldn't notice?" She shook her head, brushing past me. "You always were dramatic. Things change. What matters is moving forward." Her avoidance stung more than a slap. I could hear my father's voice in my memory, steady and true, reminding me that trust wasn't supposed to be temporary. I clenched the papers. "You can fool all the people some of the time," I said quietly, "but you cannot fool all the people all the time." Her face hardened, but she didn't respond. Sophronia chuckled as though daring me to push further. That weekend, he insisted on dragging me to a dinner at a bar and grill in Fort Worth. Mother urged me to go for family's sake. Against my better judgment, I went. The place was noisy, televisions blaring sports highlights, the smell of fried food heavy in the air. Sophronia had gathered a small group of friends, loud and eager to flatter him. I sat at the far end, nursing a glass of water, watching him play the role of successful heir. He raised his glass. "To family, and to knowing who really carries the legacy." His friends cheered. One leaned toward me, smirking. "Guess you didn't get much, huh?" Laughter erupted. My cheeks burned, but I refused to let them see me shrink. I sat still, letting silence sharpen around me. Then I spoke, softly but firmly. "Legacies aren't measured in pawn tickets or empty laughter." The table fell quiet for a moment. Uneasy glances passed between them before someone forced a joke to fill the space. The tension hung like smoke. I realized then that this dinner wasn't about food or company. It was a stage, and they had cast me as the outsider. I drove home afterward, headlights slicing through the Texas night. Every laugh replayed in my mind, every smirk a knife turning deeper. American families love to mask betrayal with smiles, I thought. They prefer the illusion of unity over the discomfort of truth. But illusions fade. I knew that now. Back at my apartment, I spread the documents across my desk under a bright lamp. I studied the signatures again, the swapped lines, the erasure of my name. My hands steadied as I whispered, "If they think forged ink can bury truth, they've underestimated me." The night had ended with their laughter, but I knew tomorrow would bring a clue they never expected. It was a Sunday afternoon in May when my mother called for a family meeting. I drove to the house with a knot in my stomach, knowing these meetings never ended in anything good for me. The blinds in the living room were half drawn, letting in slivers of light that cut across the floor like dividing lines. The air felt stale, closed off, as though the house itself wanted no witnesses. Sophronia sat planted in the middle of the room, legs spread, leaning back like a king in his court. Mother sat beside him, her hands folded, her expression firm. To anyone else, it might have looked like a regular gathering, but I felt like I was walking into a courtroom where the verdict had already been written. I repeated a line in my head, "You can't choose your family, but you can choose how you let them treat you." That thought steadied me as I sat down on a lone chair at the edge of the room. The first blow came sooner than I expected. Sophronia leaned forward, that half smile on his face, and said with relish, "Dad's watch? Pawned it. Use the money to seed my project. That's how real men build futures." A few friends of his had been invited, sitting in the room as if they were jury members. They chuckled at his words, nodding approvingly. His eyes, though, stayed locked on me. I breathed slowly and replied, my voice calm. "That watch wasn't yours to sell. It wasn't just time. It was Dad's legacy." Sophronia tilted his head, his smirk deepening. "Legacies aren't handed to dreamers. They're built by doers." He would have wanted someone who could actually make use of it. Inside, fury clawed at me, but I refused to let it spill. He thinks theft is ambition, I thought. Out loud, I said nothing more, letting his arrogance echo in the space. To him, pawning the Rolex was a triumph. To me, it was a confession. The Rolex, once a symbol of memory, had been reduced by him to a pawn ticket. His boast wasn't just cruel, it was his way of declaring dominance in front of others. Mother sat silently through it all, neither defending me nor condemning him. That silence told me everything. The meeting continued, but the weight hadn't yet fallen. My mother reached into her bag and pulled out the old household keychain. The metallic jingle made my chest tighten. Without hesitation, she placed it in Sophronia's hand. "You'll need these," she said. "You're taking responsibility for family matters now." I felt my breath catch. "Dad trusted me with those documents for years," I said, louder than I intended. "You're not just handing him keys, you're handing him everything." Mother's eyes slid away from mine. She didn't argue, didn't even attempt to soften it. Her silence was a quiet nod of allegiance to him. Sophronia dangled the keys between his fingers, grinning. "Looks like the house finally has someone dependable." The word dependable landed like a slap. I clenched my fists under the table, fighting to keep my voice level. Dependable doesn't mean loyal. It doesn't mean honest either. He leaned closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "It means useful. And you've never been that." I sat back, steadying my breathing. He wanted me to lash out, to give him a spectacle in front of his friends. Instead, I gave him silence. Inside, though, a thought pulsed hard. This isn't about objects. It's about erasing me completely. Keys unlock doors, and they lock people out. Handing him those keys wasn't just about practical access. It was about rewriting the family script, leaving me outside, watching through the window. Home is where the heart is, I thought bitterly. And by this definition, my home is no longer here. The rest of the meeting blurred, voices blending into meaningless chatter. Sophronia pocketed the keys, his smug grin never fading. My mother sat tall beside him, choosing her silence like armor. I excused myself quietly, walked to my car, and sat behind the wheel, gripping it until my knuckles whitened. Losing the watch was painful. Losing the keys was final. Together, they weren't just symbols. They were a declaration that my place in this family was gone. Yet I didn't cry. I didn't crumble. I remembered my father's words. Strength is quiet, not loud. So I chose silence, not the silence of defeat, but the silence of patience. I would not fight them on their stage, under their lights. I would gather proof, bide my time. They may have the house, I whispered to myself, but I have the truth, and the truth is harder to bury than a watch. When I walked back into the house to grab my bag, Sophronia glanced at me and whispered under his breath, "She's officially out now." Mother didn't argue. She didn't even flinch. Her silence sealed it. I left without another word, but inside I carried a fire. They thought it was over, but I knew the game had only just begun. The days after that so-called family meeting dragged on like heavy chains. Every step I took back into my apartment carried the weight of betrayal. My shoulders ached not from work at school, but from the silence I carried home after hearing Sophronia gloat and watching Mother hand him the keys. I spent evenings pacing my small living room, replaying the scene, trying to remind myself that strength was not in loud anger, but in steady resolve. One night, when exhaustion had finally set in, my phone rang. The caller ID was unfamiliar, just a local number from Arlington. My first instinct was to let it go to voicemail, but something in me pressed answer. "Miss Mireille?" The voice on the other end was calm, older, with a hint of hesitation. "Yes, this is she. I'm calling from a pawn shop here in Arlington. A Rolex came through my counter some weeks ago. I didn't think much of it until I looked closer. There's something inside this watch, something you ought to see." "It doesn't belong to anyone but you." I gripped the phone tighter, my mind racing. "You're sure?" "Yes, ma'am. I thought long and hard before dialing your number, but when I realized what was tucked inside, I knew it wasn't meant for the man who pawned it." Confusion, suspicion, and a sudden flare of hope collided inside me. I'd grown up knowing pawn shops were where people went when they had nothing left but items too precious to keep. In America, pawn shops were confessionals without priests, stories of desperation, survival, and sometimes betrayal. My family had turned my father's memory into currency, but maybe, just maybe, the truth was still hiding in plain sight. I thanked the man, promised to come by, and hung up. My hands shook as I set the phone down. Before I drove to Arlington, I pulled out the wooden box again, the same one that had mocked me with its emptiness. Under the dim glow of my desk lamp, I studied it more carefully. That's when I noticed faint marks inside, nearly invisible to the careless eye, initials my father had carved, hidden where only someone determined would see. "Dad never left things unfinished," I whispered. "He left trails." I traced the marks with my fingertips. The box itself was a message. The Rolex might have been stolen, but the box carried a silent testimony that betrayal had been expected, maybe even planned for. Winston Churchill once said, "Out of intense complexities, intense simplicities emerge." The simplicity here was devastating and clarifying. My father knew what kind of family war would ignite after he was gone. The next morning, I drove to Arlington. The road wound past neighborhoods of small homes with tidy lawns, past strip malls where neon lights flickered against dusty windows. Pawn shops in Texas all looked the same. Barred windows, cluttered display cases, the smell of metal and second chances. The one I walked into was no different. Guitars lined the wall, televisions stacked haphazardly, jewelry cases crowded with watches and rings, each item a story of someone's worst day. Behind the counter stood a man in his 50s, his posture stiff but his eyes kind. He recognized me instantly. "You must be Miss Mireille," he said, extending a hand. "I am," I replied, shaking it firmly. "You said you had something for me?" He nodded, his expression serious. I wasn't sure if I should call. I've seen families torn apart over less than a watch, but when I saw what was hidden inside, I knew it didn't belong to the man who brought it in. He called himself Sophronia. I stiffened at the name, but said nothing. Come with me. He led me to a small back room, dimly lit and quiet. He reached into a locked drawer and pulled out a black velvet pouch. Inside it was my father's Rolex. My chest tightened, a mix of relief and dread washing over me. The man set it gently on the counter and unscrewed the back with deliberate care. From within, he slid out a folded piece of paper, aged but intact. "This doesn't belong to me," he said softly. "It belongs to you." My breath caught. For weeks, I had been treated as though I was erased, an afterthought. And yet, here it was. Proof my father had left me something no one could pawn away. I took the watch in my hands, feeling its weight differently now. Sophronia thought pawning it erased me, but he didn't know that truth doesn't die in a pawn ticket. In America, people often say, "You can't bury the truth. It grows roots." My father had planted those roots deep enough that even betrayal couldn't choke them. I clutched the Rolex with trembling hands, the folded paper still sealed inside. My mind raced with questions. Was it a letter, a hidden will, or something more? For the first time since his death, I felt my father's voice reaching out, and I wasn't ready for what it was about to say. July came with a strange invitation from my mother. She called me one morning, her voice unusually bright. "Adassa," she said, "why don't you come for dinner this Sunday? Just a peaceful meal. No arguing, no business." The word peaceful lingered in my ear like a trick. Still, I agreed. Maybe part of me wanted to believe she still had room in her heart for me. When I arrived, the dining table was set as if for a banquet. Expensive dishes, polished silverware, wine glasses filled in advance. Yet the room didn't feel welcoming. It felt staged, like a play where every role had been decided before I walked in. Sophronia sat at the head, mother glowing beside him. Halfway through the meal, Sophronia lifted his wrist high, letting the light catch a shining Rolex. "This," he declared, "represents the future of our family. Proof that I'm the one carrying the torch." The others clapped. Mother offered a thin smile, but my eyes stayed on the watch. The shine was wrong. Too new, too polished, none of the scratches that Dad's Rolex bore after years on construction sites and long commutes. That's not Dad's watch, I thought. That's a cheap replacement. I couldn't help myself. "Funny," I said aloud, my tone steady. "Dad's watch had scratches from years of work. This one looks like it was born yesterday." The table fell quiet for a beat. Sophronia scoffed. "Details don't matter. What matters is the story we tell." I leaned back, forcing a faint smile. "You can polish a lie, but it's still a lie." His smirk faltered, just for a moment. My suspicion from the pawnshop call was confirmed. He'd pawned the real one, and this fake was his cover. Dinner ended, and I found my mother in the kitchen alone, rinsing dishes. The hum of running water masked my footsteps until I spoke. "You knew, didn't you?" I asked. "You knew he pawned Dad's Rolex. That thing he wears is a fake." She froze, her back stiffening. For a long moment, the only sound was the clatter of a plate against porcelain. Finally, she spoke without turning around. "You were always too much like your father," she said quietly. "Stubborn. Impossible to control. That's why I had to let you go." Her words sliced deeper than Sophronia's mockery ever could. I swallowed, trying to steady my voice. "So it wasn't neglect. It wasn't a mistake. You chose this. You chose him." She turned then, her eyes cold. "Peace is fragile, Adassa. I protect what I can. Sometimes that means sacrificing what doesn't fit." I shook my head, disbelief mixing with fury. "You didn't protect peace. You traded truth for comfort. You sided with the one who sold Dad's memory for cash." She looked down at the dish towel in her hands, twisting it as if wringing out a confession she didn't want to make. But her silence was answer enough. Injustice has a way of echoing louder in the quiet. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And standing there in my mother's kitchen, I realized even this house was not immune. I whispered to myself, barely audible, "Even in this house." I left without another word. Arguments were wasted here. Truth had no audience in this home. Walking out into the Texas night, the heat pressed down on me. but the stars overhead felt like witnesses. Sophronia's fake Rolex, Mother's confession, it was all proof they were rewriting history together. But they underestimated me. Words weren't my weapon now. Silence would be. Action would be. They think they've erased me, I thought, glancing back at the glowing windows, but they just confessed their own crime. The truth was waiting, and soon I would put it on the table where they couldn't look away. The air inside the lawyer's office was thick after Sophronia's outburst. Papers lay scattered where he'd slammed his fist, water trembling in half-empty glasses. For a long moment, no one spoke. All eyes turned toward me, waiting. My heart drummed, but I leaned forward slowly, fixing my gaze on him. "You sold the watch," I said, my voice clear, deliberate, but you couldn't erase the truth inside it. The words landed like a final gavel. Sophronia's face flushed crimson, the smug grin wiped clean. Mother lowered her eyes, folding her hands tightly in her lap, while the lawyer gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging the strike. It was the kind of moment Americans call a drop the mic. Nothing more needed to be said, yet the silence screamed louder than his shouts had minutes before. I had reclaimed my voice, and it was stronger than his rage. But rage came anyway. Sophronia sprang to his feet, his voice cracking with fury. "This proves nothing." "She forged it." His hand shook as he pointed toward the letter. "She's desperate, clinging to fantasies. You're all blind if you can't see it." The lawyer, calm and collected, adjusted her glasses. "Forgery doesn't pawn itself. We have records." I reached into my bag and pulled out the pawn shop receipt, the ink of his name as damning as fingerprints. I slid it across the polished table. "Care to explain this?" His eyes widened as he recognized his own handwriting. He stammered, scrambling for excuses. "It was a business move. I was going to buy it back. That was the plan all along." The desperation in his voice cracked the image he tried to project. Everyone in the room could see it, the unraveling. I thought of something Mark Twain once said, "If you tell the truth, you don't have to remember anything." Sophronia was tripping over his own lies, each word making his story less believable. The lawyer pressed on. "Tell us, Mr. Griselda, where are the financial records for this business you claim the money supported?" He faltered. "The documents, they're in process. I can provide them later." "Convenient," she said flatly. The notary scribbled notes while Sophronia's so-called business partners, friends he had brought along to watch his victory, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One coughed, another avoided his gaze entirely. The distance between them was growing by the second. "You sold your father's heirloom to fund a scam," the lawyer stated. "That's theft and fraud." My voice joined hers, steady and cutting. "Dad's watch built nothing, but it just tore down your empire of lies." Mother finally broke her silence, her voice trembling. "He just wanted a chance, can't you see? He thought he could build something." I turned to her, meeting her eyes. "So did I. The difference is I never stole it. I never betrayed him." She looked away again, shame creeping into the corners of her face. The letter, the receipt, the absence of records, it all stacked against Sophronia. His house of cards was collapsing under the weight of truth. And as the American phrase goes, a house of cards always falls. Sophronia shoved his chair back, the screech of wood against the floor jarring. "This is ridiculous!" he shouted, his fists clenched. He stormed toward the door, slamming it behind him so hard the glass panes rattled. The lawyer sighed, gathering the papers. "You have what you need," she told me. "He'll face consequences. The law will ensure it." I stayed seated, clutching the Rolex in my hands. It was more than an heirloom now. It was proof, survival, the memory of my father that no scheme could erase. Truth doesn't need volume, I thought. It only needs proof. I whispered to myself, a vow more than a reflection. This war was never about property. It was about Dad's name. And I won't let it be forgotten. The lawyer offered a small nod of reassurance before leaving the room. Mother lingered, her shoulders slumped, her eyes never meeting mine. Her silence was its own confession. I rose, Rolex in hand, the folded letter pressed safely against my palm. As I stepped into the hallway, Sophronia's voice echoed from the far end, raw with venom. "You'll regret this. I'll take everything you have." I didn't turn back. I walked through the double doors, out into the sweltering Texas heat, the sun glaring down, but my steps steady. His threats followed me outside, but I knew the real fight had just begun, in the court of truth, not family lies. A few days after the showdown in the lawyer's office, the ripples began to spread. In small Texas towns, news doesn't stay contained. It seeps into coffee shops, church pews, and grocery store aisles. I started hearing whispers when I stopped for gas or picked up milk. Sophronia's name was spoken in hushed tones, heads leaning closer, eyebrows raised. Family friends who once praised him as ambitious now avoided him altogether. The men who had called themselves his business partners no longer returned his calls. It was as if the community itself had turned cold, a collective verdict without needing a courtroom. In Texas, people talk, I reminded myself, and sometimes that's all the justice you need. I didn't need revenge in the traditional sense. Watching the truth ripple outward was enough. Sophronia's empire was crumbling, and I hadn't lifted more than the truth to do it. My strength came from patience. His downfall was built into his own arrogance. Back in the lawyer's office, the process moved forward. Alethea Siana sat across from him, her tone measured but unyielding. She laid out the papers, each page a nail in the coffin of his scam. "You didn't just pawn property," she said, sliding the pawn receipt closer to him. "You pawned trust. That's actionable." Sophronia scoffed. "This is a family matter, not a legal one. Families fight. Families misunderstand." "Fraud doesn't stop being fraud just because you share blood," she answered. "The law doesn't bend to your excuses." I sat quietly, watching his face lose color as she spoke. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. The law had become the impartial parent I never had, steady, firm, unwilling to excuse the favorite child's lies. I thought of how the American system often works. Slow to move, but once set in motion, it crushes arrogance. Harry Truman once said, "You can't get rich in politics unless you're a crook." My brother wasn't in politics, but he'd played the same game, pretending scams were opportunity, disguising greed as ambition. Then came my moment. I pulled out the pawnshop receipt, Sophronia's signature in bold ink. My hand didn't shake as I laid it flat on the table. "You wanted proof," I said, my voice low but cutting. "This is the ink you can't wash off." The lawyer picked it up, tapped it once against the table, and declared, "Undeniable evidence." Sophronia stuttered, his voice cracking. I was going to return it. That was my plan." "Intent doesn't erase action," the lawyer shot back. Mother finally spoke, her voice trembling. "He was desperate. You know he just wanted a chance." I turned to her, my tone unflinching. "Desperation doesn't pawn legacy. Choice does." Her face crumpled, but I didn't let myself look away. That receipt wasn't just paper. It was betrayal in ink, harder to scrub away than any excuse they could muster. America respects receipts, both literal and metaphorical. This one was stronger than any of their lies. The tension in the room peaked. Sophronia shoved back his chair, his face twisted with fury. He stormed out, the door slamming hard enough to rattle the certificates on the wall. His reputation, already frayed, was now in tatters. Mother remained seated, staring down at her hands. I could see it in her eyes, the dawning realization that she had backed the wrong heir. She had handed him the keys, but he'd locked himself out. I rose, gathering the Rolex and my father's letter. My steps were lighter than they had been in months. "Justice is truth in action," I murmured, recalling Benjamin Disraeli's words. And here it was, unfolding before me. Walking out of that office, I wasn't just stronger, I was free from their shadows. But as I stepped into the blistering Texas heat, my phone buzzed. A message from Sophronia lit the screen. "You think you've won? Watch me burn it all down." I gripped the Rolex tighter, the weight of it grounding me. He wasn't done fighting, but neither was I. The night air outside my apartment hummed with the chorus of cicadas, a sound that always reminded me summer in Texas had reached its peak. I sat at my desk with the lamp casting a soft halo across the worn wooden surface. For days I had carried the Rolex back and forth, afraid to open what I knew was hidden inside. But tonight, I could no longer avoid it. I turned the watch over in my hands, fingers steady, though my chest tightened with every breath. With deliberate care, I unfolded the paper that had been tucked inside for so long. The handwriting was slightly faded, but the loops and curves of the letters were unmistakably my father's. The sight brought him alive again for me. His hand had once pressed this ink into the fibers. His thoughts had once lingered over these very words. Tears stung, but I didn't let them fall. "To my youngest," the letter began, "you are never out." I traced the words with my fingertip, as though by touching them I could touch him again. "Blood remembers," I whispered, an old saying that suddenly felt heavier than ever. He knew. He knew betrayal was coming, and he had left this for me not just as comfort, but as armor. I leaned back in my chair, pressing the letter to my chest. Reverence, grief, and an unexpected comfort settled inside me all at once. For the first time in months, I felt like I wasn't alone in this fight. I read on. My father's words carried his voice straight into the silence of my apartment. He confessed his fears, that others might manipulate, that greed would gnaw at what was supposed to be sacred. That's why he had chosen the Rolex, not for its price, but because it was the one thing no one could erase without leaving traces. Honesty, resilience, patience, he wrote. Hold these, and you'll never lose yourself. I whispered back, "You knew. All this time, you knew." The Rolex had been a symbol of time, but this letter was timeless. He had turned an object into a vessel for truth. I thought of a line I'd once read, "A father is a son's first hero and a daughter's first protector." My father had protected me the only way he could now, through words. I folded the paper again, carefully, and placed it beside me. The warmth that spread through my chest was different from the bitter fire I'd carried for months. This warmth healed instead of burned. Sitting there, I let the journey wash over me, the humiliation of being placed at the edge of the table, the sting of erased photographs, the lies thrown like stones, the pawn ticket waved like victory. And now, his words, lifting me from that pit. Freedom, I realized, wasn't about defeating them in their own arena. Freedom was no longer needing their recognition. "They said I was out," I whispered, reading the words again. "But Dad wrote me back in." The contrast was sharp. Sophronia had pawned the Rolex for greed. I held it now for meaning. One of us saw cash, the other saw memory. Maya Angelou's words surfaced in my mind. I can be changed by what happens to me, but I refuse to be reduced by it. American families fracture over inheritances every day. I'd read stories, seen neighbors go silent after funerals, but dignity was the only thing that could heal what money tore apart. By the time dawn arrived, I knew my path. I wasn't going to spend my life fighting to prove myself to people who had already chosen blindness. My fight now was to live forward, not backward. The next morning, sunlight spilled across my apartment floor. I placed the Rolex and the letter inside a locked box of my own, tucking it into the back of my closet. It wasn't hiding, it was safeguarding. True inheritance wasn't objects, it was strength. It was the choice to rise above, even when rising meant walking away. Justice is not always loud, I murmured. It can be the quiet choice to walk away stronger. I dressed for work, pulling my bag over my shoulder. Sophronia's downfall would continue. His threats promised more storms, but that was his story now. Mine was shifting toward independence. I walked into my classroom that morning, the Rolex hidden in my bag, my father's letter resting safely inside. My students filled the room with chatter, backpacks dropping, laughter bubbling. Watching them, I thought, this is where legacy lives, in who we teach, not what we own. The war at home wasn't finished, but for the first time, I felt free. By mid-August, the collapse of Sophronia's world was no longer a secret. It was front-page gossip in every corner of Dallas and Fort Worth. Investors he had charmed with promises of quick returns were demanding their money back. Some had already filed lawsuits. Former friends who once toasted him now crossed the street to avoid his glare. His name was mud, and in America, reputation is currency. Once you lose it, no amount of money can buy it back. I heard it everywhere. At the grocery store checkout, two women whispered, "That Griselda boy, Thought he was going to be the next big shot. Now he can't even show his face. At school, one of my colleagues leaned over and said, "Funny how the proud fall hardest." It wasn't just talk, it was a reckoning. Then one evening, Sophronia showed up at my apartment door. His knock wasn't polite, it was pounding, desperate. When I opened, I barely recognized him. His face was unshaven, eyes bloodshot, clothes wrinkled. "Adasa, please," he said, almost collapsing against the doorframe. "Help me. You have Dad's letter. Tell them it was all a mistake. Say I was meant to handle things." I stood still, the Rolex heavy in my hand. "Now you need me?" He swallowed hard. "They're after me. Investors, lawyers, everyone. Just one word from you and it could turn around." "No," I said firmly. "You pawned Dad's memory. That was your choice. This," I tapped the letter folded inside the watch, "was his choice, and you can't rewrite it." For the first time, his eyes dropped. He muttered something I couldn't catch and stumbled back down the hallway. Watching him leave, I knew. This was the moment I had been waiting for. His power was gone, stripped not by me, but by his own hands. A week later, we met for the final time at the family house. Mother was there, sitting quietly in the corner, her face pale. Sophronia paced, his words spilling out fast. "We can share, Adasa. Just tell them you forgive me, say we worked it out. No one has to know the details." I set the Rolex on the table between us. It gleamed under the overhead light, shining like judgment. "Forgiveness doesn't erase receipts," I said, calm but sharp. "Dad's watch spoke louder than your lies." Mother looked up, her voice trembling. "He's still family, Adasa. Don't forget that." "Family doesn't pawn each other's souls," I answered. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Maya Angelou's words echoed in my head. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. Sophronia had shown me over and over, and I finally believed him. He lunged suddenly, reaching for the Rolex, but I pulled it back swiftly. "No," I said. "You've had enough." He froze, his chest heaving. Mother pressed her hand to her mouth, whispering through tears, "Please, stop this." But it was already finished. I stood, holding both the Rolex and my father's letter. Sophronia's eyes burned with rage, but mine were clear. "You wanted everything," I told him, "but you ended up with nothing. That's not my doing. That's yours." He shouted. Mother sobbed softly, but I didn't waver. I walked out of that house, into the sunlight. In his hand, Sophronia still held the keys Mother had given him months ago. But those keys unlocked nothing now, just empty rooms and empty promises. In mine, I carried the Rolex and the letter, and with them, peace. In American families, inheritance wars are never about money. They're about memory, and memory cannot be pawned. Sometimes winning means walking away, and that's exactly what I did. Weeks later, Sophronia was facing legal charges. Every detail of his scam was laid bare. The community turned its back on him entirely. Mother withdrew from public, rarely leaving the house. I returned to my classroom in Dallas, where purpose came not from relics, but from shaping young minds. Dad's real legacy wasn't the Rolex. It was resilience, integrity, courage. I wore the watch only on anniversaries, not as a reminder of betrayal, but as a symbol of endurance. Frederick Douglass once wrote, "It is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men." That line stayed with me every time I stood before my students. One evening, driving through Arlington, I slowed as I passed the pawn shop where the truth had first resurfaced. The neon sign still flickered, casting its glow on the sidewalk. "They thought I was out," I whispered to myself. But I was never out. I was always his. And with every step forward, I carried my father's truth with me. Unshakable, untouchable. My name is Adasa Mireille. I'm 32, a high school English teacher in Dallas, and tonight I'm trying to find words for something I've never been able to explain to anyone outside my family. My father died this past winter, and the only thing he left in my hands was his Rolex. He wasn't a wealthy man. He worked long hours in construction and sometimes took side jobs fixing houses. That watch wasn't a symbol of luxury, it was proof of the hours he'd poured into his life. When I held it, I could almost feel the rhythm of his days beating against my palm. Benjamin Franklin once said, "Lost time is never found again." I think about that line every time I turn the crown of the watch and hear the faint click. My father's time was gone, and this was all I had left to measure it by. To me, it was more than a timepiece. It was the anchor keeping me from drifting too far into grief. It reminded me of who he was and of who he believed I could be. The day of the memorial dinner in Fort Worth, I clutched the Rolex in my coat pocket before walking into my mother's house. She had remarried years ago, and the place had long stopped feeling like mine. The smell of rosemary chicken drifted from the kitchen. The chatter of relatives, most from my stepfather's side, filled the living room. I stepped in, smiled politely, and braced myself. Inside, the long dining table was crowded. Sophronia, my stepbrother, sat near the head, basking in the laughter of two uncles who weren't mine. My mother, Orembiash Petra, hovered beside him, nodding approvingly as if he were the natural heir to something I couldn't see. A cousin waved me over. "Well, at least you're here. We weren't sure if you'd come." His tone was casual, but I heard the sting beneath it. My seat was waiting, but not at the main table. A small chair was wedged near the swinging kitchen door, so close that every time the staff passed with trays, I had to lean aside. The chair wobbled, one leg uneven, and the plate in front of me didn't match the set on the main table. At first, I laughed to myself. Maybe it was coincidence, but as I settled in, I realized it wasn't. It was a message without words. You don't belong at the center anymore. I looked across the room. Sophronia held court with ease, telling stories about his business ventures. He made them sound grand, as though he were building empires, though I knew most of them fizzled out as quickly as they started. My mother's laughter was the loudest, punctuating his every line. She barely looked in my direction. "Dad always wanted someone to carry the family name forward," Sophronia declared, lifting his glass. His friends nodded like disciples. I felt my face flush, but I didn't interrupt. I knew what he was doing, recasting himself as the chosen one. I thought funny how silence can cut deeper than words. Dinner stretched on. The room smelled of gravy and roasted potatoes, but for me, the taste was metallic. The Rolex in my pocket pressed against my thigh, steady and solid. Each clink of silverware on porcelain felt like another reminder that I was sitting at the edge, invisible. I remembered my father's voice, low and firm, the last night we spoke. "Take care of yourself and keep this watch safe." He never said much about legacy, but those words told me everything. I wasn't invisible to him. He knew exactly who I was. I sat straighter in the wobbly chair. They thought placing me by the kitchen would diminish me. They didn't realize the distance gave me perspective. I could watch everyone, my mother's approving nods, Sophronia's smirks, the sideways glances of relatives, testing where the power leaned. They saw me as removed. I saw myself as positioned to observe every move. As the plates were cleared, the noise softened to a hum. Sophronia leaned toward my mother, whispering something I couldn't catch. She turned her head slightly, eyes flicking in my direction, then back to him. The faintest smile crossed his lips. I felt the weight of that look. It wasn't about dinner. It was about decisions made in rooms where I wasn't invited. They thought seating me at the edge made me invisible. They didn't know I was already watching every move. The following month, March, I returned again to my mother's house. The atmosphere had grown colder, and so had the conversations. What used to be subtle exclusions now began to sharpen into something undeniable. That evening in the living room, a discussion over family finances spiraled into confrontation. Sophronia leaned forward in his chair, his tone smug. "She's out. We decided." The words fell heavy, like a hammer striking marble. My eyes darted to my mother, waiting for her to object, to remind him that some decisions were never his to make. But she said nothing. Her silence was a seal of approval. I sat still, my chest tightening. Betrayal has a sound. Sometimes it's not yelling or slammed doors. Sometimes it's silence agreeing with cruelty. "Family isn't supposed to vote you out," I muttered, more to myself than to them. Sophronia smirked, stretching his arms behind his head as though the matter were settled. Eleanor Roosevelt's words echoed in my mind. No one can make you feel inferior without your consent. I repeated it like a shield, even as humiliation burned beneath my skin. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. I excused myself without another word and walked upstairs into my father's old study. The air there still smelled faintly of cedar and dust, mixed with the lingering hint of his leather chair. On the shelf, tucked behind worn books, sat the wooden box where Dad's Rolex had always been kept. I pulled it out carefully, the familiar scratches on the lid catching the light. My hands trembled as I lifted it open. Empty. The sight knocked the air from my lungs. That watch had been the last tangible piece of him, and now even that was gone. I traced the edges of the box, running my fingers over grooves where his initials had been faintly carved years ago. I could almost hear his voice in my ear. Take care of yourself, and keep this watch safe. Dad, I whispered, my throat tight, they think I'm out, but I won't let them erase me. The box mocked me with its hollowness, but beneath the despair, a current of determination stirred. This emptiness wasn't an end, it was a clue. Something had been done, and where there are actions, there are trails. I carried the box downstairs, holding it against me like a fragile truth. Where is Dad's Rolex? I asked my mother, standing in the kitchen doorway. My voice was steady, though the weight of grief pressed hard against my chest. He told me to keep it safe. She avoided my eyes, busying herself with arranging dishes that didn't need arranging. Don't dwell on the past, she said softly. Things change. Her words sliced sharper than if she'd shouted. Sophronia leaned casually against the counter, his grin lazy and cruel. Maybe he never meant it for you, he said. Maybe you imagined it. I stared at him, letting the silence hang. Then I answered, calm and precise. Memories can't be pawned, Sophronia, but lies always leave receipts. His smirk deepened. He thought I was powerless, that I had no proof, that their word outweighed mine. What's done in the dark will always come to light, I added, my tone even. The room fell still for a moment. He scoffed, breaking the silence with a laugh. You always did like your little sayings, but sayings don't change reality. I turned back to my mother. You let him take what Dad left for me. That wasn't yours to give away. Her lips parted, as if to reply, but nothing came out. Silence again. Always silence when the truth demanded courage. I walked away before they could see the sting in my eyes. Confrontation was useless here. They had chosen their alliance. I realized in that moment that this wasn't neglect. This was deliberate removal. Alone later, I sat with the empty box in my lap. My mind steadied into a different rhythm. If they thought I was finished, they were underestimating me. I whispered into the quiet. Silence can be sharper than any blade. I decided then, I wouldn't fight on their terms. I would wait. I would gather. I would let their own arrogance uncover them. That night, the house settled into sleep, but I remained awake, tracing my father's initials carved faintly on the wooden lid. The box was empty, but their arrogance had left a trail. I only had to follow it. The July sun pressed down hard on Fort Worth, but inside the lawyer's office, the air felt cool and tense. I walked in with my father's Rolex tucked carefully in my bag. My hands were steady, though my heart beat against my ribs like it wanted out. The office was lined with framed certificates, degrees hung with pride, and bookshelves filled with heavy volumes of law. A mahogany table stretched across the room, polished to a sharp gleam. At the center sat Alethea Siana, the lawyer presiding over this so-called family discussion. Papers lay neatly stacked before her, and a notary sat silently to the side, pen ready. Across from me, Mother sat with her hands clasped tightly, her posture rigid, but her eyes carefully blank. Sophronia leaned back in his chair, smugness radiating from every line of his body. This isn't just a meeting, I thought as I sat down. This is trial by family. The lawyer adjusted her glasses, her tone even. We're here to clarify matters concerning Mr. Mireille's estate and ensure everything is handled fairly. The truth will out. Sophronia smirked as though the truth belonged to him already. I waited until the right moment, then pulled the Rolex from my bag and set it gently on the table. Sophronia laughed, sharp and dismissive. That cheap pawn shop trinket again? Haven't you embarrassed yourself enough? I ignored his mockery. With calm hands, I unscrewed the back of the watch. The room grew still, every breath held. Out slipped a folded letter, its edges yellowed but intact, my father's handwriting unmistakable across the paper. The lawyer leaned forward, examining it. "This appears to be a testament," she said, her voice more formal now. Sophronia's eyes widened, his face losing its confident mask. That could be fake," he stammered. I turned to him, my voice steady and sharp. "Fake? Like the watch on your wrist?" The silence that followed cut deeper than any argument. Theodore Roosevelt once said, "In any moment of decision, the best thing you can do is the right thing." My father had done the right thing by leaving me proof, and now it was here on the table for all to see. The lawyer unfolded the letter and began to read. Father's words were clear. The Rolex was left to me, along with his trust that I would safeguard his legacy. Sophronia burst out, his voice rising. "Dad never said that to me. He wanted me to lead, not her." The lawyer raised a hand, her tone firm. "This document is binding. Your father's words are plain." I looked at my mother, waiting for her to speak. Her eyes dropped to the table, her silence more damning than anything she could have said aloud. I leaned forward. "You pawned his trust, Sophronia. You mocked his gift. And now, his own words erase your lies." He slammed his fist on the table, rattling the glasses of water. "No one will believe you!" "The law already does," I answered. The room seemed to close in tighter as tension escalated. The lawyer's table had become a battlefield, truth against manipulation, silence against arrogance. "What's done in the dark always comes to light," I said. Sophronia's face reddened, his composure cracking. His words grew louder, more desperate, but every outburst only dug him deeper. Finally, I leaned back, letting the silence work. I didn't need to fight anymore. Silence was stronger than rage. My father's letter spoke for me. The lawyer confirmed it. "This will be entered into the record. The Rolex and this document secure Miss Mireille's rights." Mother's eyes still avoided mine. I could see betrayal carved into the lines of her face. Inside, I felt steady, almost calm. Their arrogance gave me everything I needed. My father gave me the rest. They say silence is sometimes the most powerful scream. In that office, my silence spoke louder than Sophronia's shouting ever could. As the meeting ended, Sophronia leaned toward me, his voice low and seething. "This isn't over. You'll regret this." I walked out without turning back, clutching the Rolex and letter against my chest. He had just declared war, and I was ready.